Hi everyone, welcome to yet another session of Daily Word Webs on the channel Sluggers for your CAT preparation. I'm Anupam Mishra, and today's the route we'll be taking up in today's session is Psyche, which stands for mind. Which according to Gautam Buddha is everything, right? What do you think you become? Okay, so let's start with the session. Let's see, the episode flow of this is going to be very simple. In the next part, we'll move on to your root info, where I'll tell you about the meaning of the roots and the origin language from which they have been derived. उसके बाद we'll move on to the word web. The word web is the part जहाँ पे हम लोग will look at some words which derive their meaning from these roots. We'll learn of them, learn those words etymologically. After which we'll look at the same words as part of sentences, right? Just so that you're able to internalize your learnings. Finally, you'll give a very short test and then we'll close with a summary. So guys, the root psyche, it's a Latin term that can have a very broad, that can take broad meanings depending on which word we are talking about, right? So it can stand for mind, spirit, soul, breath. However, psyche as a Latin term is in turn derived from yet another Greek term which is pronounced something like Psyche, right? Psyche. So that's what this would be pronounced as Psyche in Greek language, and that gave rise to Psyche, and which in turn has been appropriated to many words of the English language. Okay, so another similar root which has meanings similar meanings on these lines would be animus. This is the root that we'll take up in the next session. Okay, for now let's start with the word web of Psyche. See, first of all, there's something very interesting about the root psyche, and which is that कि ये खुद में एक शब्द है. Okay, so psyche by itself is a word so far as the English language is concerned, apart from being a root, and the word basically stands for the idea of the mind, soul, thoughts, or feelings of an individual. अगर इसे मुझे इसका प्रयोग अगर मुझे एक सेंटेंस में करना हो, I can say that well, the way the experiences and the surroundings of a child during their formative years usually has a deep impact on their psyche, right? So अपने childhood वाली years में the kind of experiences and जिस environment में जो kids रहते हैं, children रहते हैं, बच्चे रहते हैं, that has उसका एक बहुत ही गहरा असर होता है उनके growth and development पे, उनके psyche पे, उनके mind पे, उनके soul पे, right? So and which in turn goes on to shape their personality, right? So that's a way one of the ways in which psyche can be used in a sentence. We'll look into other instances of using this word in sentences in the next part. Okay, so take it. Moving on. Next term that we have, which is very similar to the term psyche, but in terms of spelling, but quite different in terms of meaning, is psychic. Psychic. And psychic के साथ एक और term है जो मैं आपको will the aid of which we'll use to explain both the terms. एक शो हुआ करता था बहुत पहले, आई थिंक अभी भी आई डोंट थिंक इट्स एड एनी मोर, बट इट्स बेसिकली अ सीरीज व्हिच आई वॉच्ड वे बैक, काफी पहले मैंने देखी थी. इट इज टाइटल्ड मेंटलिस्ट. ओके, एंड मेंटल इट बेसिकली रिवॉल्व्स अराउंड अ लीड कैरेक्टर हु इज अ मेंटलिस्ट बट क्लेम्स टू बी अ साइकिक. ओके, अब इनका मतलब क्या है पहले वो तो समझ लो, राइट? सो मेंटलिस्ट इज बेसिकली, बाय द वे, any person who uses the powers of observation and suggestion to basically gain information about any other person that they meet, right? For example, uh, if I'm a mentalist and if I meet you for the first time as a stranger, I'm using my powers of observation and the suggestion, I'll be able to gauge information about you that you have never told me, and then if I claim, अगर तो ठीक है, तो यहाँ पे मैं, this is actually a logical process, right? When it's so far as mentalism is concerned, it's usually considered as a logical process, जहाँ पे आप you're basically essentially like Sherlocking your way into gaining information. If I may use the word Sherlock as a verb here, Sherlock is a reference to the detective, of course. I hope you guys got that. So mentalist, that's what mentalist means, right? That's what mentalism means. However, in this show, this lead character was actually a mentalist, who he claims that he had claimed earlier in the show that he was actually a psychic. Now, who's a psychic? A psychic is basically any person who claims that they have some sort of unusual or supernatural powers to by virtue of which they can either predict the future, or they can get information about anything that they have not been told, that they should probably logically not know, given the circumstances, right? Or they sometimes they even claim to be able to communicate with supernatural powers like spirits and ghosts, etc., etc., right? So that's what psychic means. So right, so they're able to, so that's what psychic stands for. And mentalism, well, I told you what it stands for. So that's an interesting meaning of, another that's an interesting word to look at, psychic. Okay, let's move on to the next one, which is psychedelic. Before we go to psychogenic, I want to talk about a few more words. एक और term है आपका psychedelic. I'm not sure you might have heard about it, about this. So psychedelic is, again, the first part derives from psyche. The later part, it derives from a Greek root delos, which stands for clear, right? So agar main, if I go by the logical meaning that I get from these roots, is like clear mind, clearing your mind, right? Something like that. However, psychedelic, like for example, psychedelic substances would be, a kind of hallucinogenic drugs which basically trigger altered states of consciousness, right? They trigger some sort of altered states of consciousness जहाँ पे your auditory or visual perception वो थोड़ी सी बदल जाती है. You start seeing colors in a normal daylight, right? Something like that. So that's what I've heard, right? So psychedelics would be that. Okay, and then generally because people associate or consider those altered states of consciousness to be usually positive, they feel like that they have reached a higher level of perception. That's why they associate the idea of it being a more clear. They feel like they have more clarity in that state by using those substances. So hence psychedelic substances, right? That's why you can see the logic of psychedelic being used as a term for those substances. However, the psychedelic as a term is not just used for these drugs or substances. It's also used for psychedelic art or psychedelic music, right? Which again, psychedelic music would be music that probably transfers you to a higher state of consciousness, to a more clear state of consciousness. Okay, so yeah, that's about psychedelic. Another term, by the way, from psyche is panpsychism. Okay, panpsychism. Now, panpsychism is a doctrine or belief जहाँ पे लोग ये मानते हैं. Now, pan, by the way, the first part pan comes from the root. It's a Greek root, which is pan, pan itself, and it means all. Okay, it stands for all. So, and psyche comes from mind. Now, what panpsychism refers to is basically a belief or a doctrine जहाँ पे लोग ये मानते हैं कि that every object, everything that you can see about yourself, like everything that's there in the universe, kind of has a mind or a spirit or a soul. Like everything is just because they're not animate, just because वो हिलते डुलते नहीं है, doesn't mean that they have no, well, spirit, right? So that's what panpsychism, the doctrine or the doctrine of panpsychism stands for, right? That you might find people who might believe in this, right? Without knowing about the term. So yeah, so that's panpsychism, by the way. Anyhow, so enough about the first word. Let's move on to the next term, which is psychogenic. Now, psychogenic, obviously, psycho comes from psyche, and genic comes from the root gen, which is again a Greek root, and it stands for giving birth to something, or causing something, or to beget something, right? To beget something. So that's what gen stands for. Now psychogenic. Now if you bring these two roots together, psyche stands for mind and gen stands for giving birth to something or causing something or to beget something, then psychogenic would stand for something that arises from the mind, something that is caused because of the mind, right? So one that arises from the mind or brain rather than other physical organs, right? So for example, if I might say that the stress, the headache, I later found out that the headache that troubled me the last time was mainly psychogenic in nature and had nothing to do with my physiology. Physiology means like my physical organs, right? उनसे उसका कोई लेना देना नहीं था. वो basically it was a headache just caused by stress or just was more psychological in nature, right? It was mainly because I was stressed about something, because I was not in a great state of mind, right? And hence and hence that which caused the headache, right? So those circumstances caused the headache. It had nothing really to do with some physiological imbalances in my head. Okay, so that could be psychogenic, right? कि ठीक है, certain types of pains could be psychogenic. You know, they are just caused because because of stress, because they don't have any physiological correlates, right? So that's psychogenic for you. Next, let's move on to the term psychology. Pretty interesting term. Now, psychology derives, obviously, psycho comes from psyche. Logy comes from logos, which stands, sometimes it stands for a word, or sometimes it stands for a study. Okay, so psychology would be nothing but the study of the mind, behavior, or thoughts of an individual or a group, generally to treat some sort of mental or emotional or behavioral disorder. So that's what psychology would mean, right? Now, if you've talked about psychology, who would be a psychologist? For example, so a psychologist is a person or is a person. Just a second, I'll just write this down first. A psychologist is someone who specializes in the study of mind and behavior, and generally is involved in the treatment of mental or emotional disorders, or mental behavioral or emotional disorders, right? That would be a psychologist, which, by the way, is different from a psychiatrist. Okay, because now psychiatrist is again an interesting term, because it derives from the first part, obviously derives from our root psyche. The second part, however, atria, the second part, it derives from the root iatros. Okay, pronounce it however you want to pronounce it, but it basically stands for, it's again a Greek root that stands for a healer. Okay, so a psychiatrist is a person who heals the disorders of the mind. Now you might ask कि ठीक है, फिर बाद में psychologist and psychiatrist में फर्क क्या हुआ, है ना? Well, in case of a psychologist, if the approach of a so far as the approach of a psychologist is concerned, they might deploy what many people consider as the psychoanalytic method. Okay. Okay, psychoanalytic method, which basically involves by talking to the person about their experiences, feelings, dreams, etc., and trying to figure out what exactly is making them ill, right? It's basically based on the method of dialogue, right? So that's what a psychologist would do, as opposed to a psychiatrist, who might also who in such cases, in addition to the dialogue, might also deploy the use of medicines, right? Might also prescribes medicines such as antidepressants, etc., right? So that would be a psychiatrist. Okay, psychologists usually don't prescribe medicines, right? Psychiatrists do. So that would be the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist. And psychoanalytics, psychoanalytic method obviously is based on the idea, the notion of psychoanalysis. By the way, the notion of psychoanalysis was for the very first time, I think, promoted by Sigmund Freud, and then it was taken ahead by Carl Jung. Okay, I will not get into the details of these great luminaries right now, because we want to stick to the vocabulary part here. Okay, so that's psychology, psychologist, psychiatrist, and the psychoanalytical method for you. Okay, so we have gone through these. Let's move on to the next part. By the way, what would you so a person who suffers from mental or behavioral disorders, and especially who suffers from these disorders to a great extent, would be considered a psychopath. Okay, it's actually a very strong term, by the way, so be careful before you use it for anyone. So psychopath is basically the first part. Psycho obviously derives from the root psyche, and path derives from the root pathos, which is once again a Greek root which stands for suffering. Okay, pathos stands for suffering. So someone who suffers from the disease of the mind, okay, would be considered a psychopath. However, it's not just about some mild issues, but rather about some, generally psychopath is a term that is used, इसको बहुत ही extreme sense में use किया जाता है. Someone who's suffering from a mental disorder, and usually with there is some sort of violent social behavior involved. ठीक है, तो उसको वहाँ पे psychopath आप use करेंगे. So yeah, so that's about psychopath for you. Uh, Talking about psychopath, let's suppose if you were to treat a psychopath, you know, what are the kind of interventions that a psychologist might use? Okay, किस तरह के intervention use होंगे? For example, there is a term that goes something like this: psychotherapy. Please excuse my handwriting. Wait, I'll correct this. Psychotherapy. Okay. Now, psychotherapy is basically uh, the treatment of mental illnesses by discussing somebody's problems. Okay, instead of, you know, something that a psychologist would deploy generally, instead of giving them drugs. So psychotherapy would be more relevant in case of a psychologist than a psychiatrist. Okay, generally speaking. Okay, so yeah, so that's psychotherapy for you. And psychopath. Similarly, from psychopath, there's another term that you can. It's basically an extension of this term. Would be psychopathology. Now, psychopathology comes from three roots. You know, the first root is psyche for mind. The second is pathos for suffering, and the third is logy, which comes from the root logos, or like study in this case, which means study in this case. So psychopathology would basically be a scientific study of various types of mental disorders. Okay, so that's what psychopathology would be for you. So okay guys, so with that I think we are done with the word web for today. Let's move on to the sentences. Okay, so let's start with the sentences. The first one says, Mark had never known such hatred for anyone, and in some faint part of his psyche, that means mind, in some faint part of his mind, he knew it wasn't quite rational, right? So somewhere in his mind he knew नहीं कि ये सही बात नहीं है. So इतना इतना गुस्सा क्यों आ रहा है किसी पे? ठीक है. So anyhow, next one. The reason for these outbreaks is not so much physical but psychological in the form of mass psychogenic illness, said Bartholomew. Right? So इन सब आउटब्रेक का जो रीजन है वो फिजिकल नहीं है. इट्स मेनली कमिंग फ्रॉम द वे पीपल आर थिंकिंग अबाउट थिंग्स. साइकोलॉजिकल कारण है यहाँ पे यार. देयर आर साइको इट्स बेसिकली अ फॉर्म ऑफ साइकोजेनिक इलनेस. दैट मींस illness that has its roots in the minds of the people, right? Which has is for birth, right? जिसका which is caused by how they are thinking about things. So it is caused in the mind, and there is no physical basis to it. है ना? Okay. Next, the direction of the stock market is always determined by a complicated mix of hard data and investor psychology, right? So that means direction of the stock market, hard data में तो definitely plays a role, but apart from that, the mental, emotional, and behavioral aspects of the investors also play a role, right? Which would be the short term for that would be investor psychology, right? Okay. Next, she could be a psychopath who kills us in our sleep, right? So you can see how this is a deviant behavior, है ना? Someone who's suffering from mental disorder and usually with violent social behavior. So she could be a psychopath who kills us in our sleep and or calls her league buddies in when we let our guard down, right? So that's the usage for this word. Finally guys, ये आपकी एक्सरसाइज वाली स्लाइड है. डेफिनेटली एंड फ्रॉम नाउ ऑनवर्ड्स लाइक हमने गूगल फॉर्म्स भी यहाँ पे डालना शुरू कर दिए हैं आपके डिस्क्रिप्शन में. सो यू कैन अटेम्प्ट दिस एक्सरसाइज इन द गूगल फॉर्म डायरेक्टली. ओके, सो या this is the short list of the terms, words and roots that we learned in this session, right? You can pause the slide and go through these ones, right? These are the primary roots, primary words, the roots that we went through on a secondary basis, and the words that we went through on a secondary basis. We'll go into the details of these roots in upcoming sessions, right? So, okay. Finally guys, my introduction, I'm Anupam Mishra and I'm Lucknow alumnus, and these are my areas of work and expertise. I've worked with these brands and organizations in the past. I've also been an academy educator, by the way. I'm recognized by some of the awards for content delivery and content design, course design. Considered arguably and widely as the best VRC educator that they ever had. Well, these are my CAT credentials. And guys, syllabus is basically my attempt to, actually जो भी मुझे problems and issues लग रहे हैं students के test prep industry में, मैं शुरू कर रहा हूँ CAT से. I want to try and plug those, and we are a growing channel right now. So my humble request to all of you कि अगर आप ये channel देख रहे हैं, अगर आपको हमारा content delivery पसंद आ रहा है, content पसंद आ रहा है, तो definitely इसे share करें अपने दोस्तों के साथ जिनको ये मददगार साबित हो सकता है. And also like and subscribe, right? So yeah, so that's about it, and I'll see you in the next session. Thank you.